this topic has been absolutely elevated to the forefront of a lot of thinking. There are a lot of truisms out there. They're being more rigorously interrogated by many of our panelists today. So, going through the memos, I sort of see kind of three broad strands that we're going to be focusing on in terms of the relationship between populism and foreign policy. One is, kind of a basic question: do populists who lead governments try and attempt to alter or reshape foreign policy in areas like economic policy, migration, security and defense? Is a populist foreign policy different? Why or why not? How do we know, right? Very fundamental question that a lot of the papers are grappling with. Two, what are the constraints on populists attempting to do so? Both domestic in terms of, say, the structure of a coalition party system, more systemic or regional, right? The membership in a constraining alliance or regional organizations like the European membership. And how do these efforts interact with these constraints? And then third, interesting that this is crafted as populism and foreign policy. How do these efforts to engage in foreign policy reverberate within the international system itself and some of its features, right? Whether it's the institutions of global governance and the way states report, whether it's certain normative frameworks and agendas that are embedded within the international system, or whether it is, accelerating promoting certain kinds of norms and agendas over others. So there's a very rich set of findings, and hopefully we'll have dialogue as well as debate as a result of today. So without further ado, I would propose that we jump right to it, and let's get to our first panel, which is Populism and Foreign Policy in Comparative View. And our first paper is co-authored by Aron and Bruno Castaño Silva, Mapping Populist and Nationalist Rhetoric in Leaders' Speeches Across Europe and North America. Floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Okay, so this project is part of a larger project that was designed to build up a speech database. So the idea was that we wanted Kirk Hawkins, Bruno Castaño Silva, and I, as well as other colleagues, to build up a database of speeches of chief executives. So basically presidents and prime ministers, because we wanted to get at this question of, whether or not there really has been an increase in populist rhetoric and also nationalist rhetoric over time. So testing really this question about whether there is actually this populist zeitgeist and this nationalist zeitgeist. And also the question about whether and to what extent these two discourses are co-articulated. So basically, so these are the research questions that concerned us. And for those of you who are familiar with the debate between de Kleen and Stavrakakis and Brubaker in Nations and Nationalism and Bonikowski, right? There's a number of people who are trying to figure out exactly to what extent these are discrete phenomena, discrete discourses, and if they are, to what extent they're used together. And then there are other sets of questions about what impact this has on policy, which I will bracket for the time being.
Great.
Okay, so quickly now. All right, so essentially what we've built is a database of chief executive speeches across North America and Europe, which is basically the region that right-wing populism is supposed to be highly concentrated. So the question was, are we going to see a secular increase in either of these discourses in the speeches over time? And if so, is this a kind of a regular increase that we see across all subregions, or is it more concentrated in certain subregions? So essentially what we did is that we used a technique that Kirk Hawkins developed from educational psychology using holistic grading techniques. So basically Hawkins has already developed this populism rubric that sort of encompasses those three elements, people centrism, anti-elitism, and Manichaeanism, and trains coders to basically grade speeches holistically in the original language. So we recruited a whole bunch of coders, about 70 expert coders. Basically, these were graduate students. We had a total of 128 leader terms, and then 31 countries, again, across Europe and North America. And for the most part, we captured the countries. We tried to capture the last 20 years. So the idea was to kind of see if we could track any sort of increases over time. Okay, so I a little bit talked about the populism rubric. I'm happy to talk about this in more detail in the Q&A, or if anyone wants to contact me later. The nationalism rubric is something I developed myself. It's based on Michael Billick's social identity theory approach. And it, like the populism rubric, ranges from 0 to 2, from no populism to highly populist. In the same way, nationalism ranges from 0 to 2, no nationalism versus high levels of nationalism in the speech. And essentially, the coders were asked to distinguish between this focus on the national self, like elevating the importance of elevating the national self in the speech, as opposed to kind of defense against national others. And so this thinking was, we wanted to see if there would be any kind of differences between this kind of positive, classically positive, versus kind of negative or exclusionary nationalist discourse. I won't get into the social conservatism here. So not sure, this is probably very, very fine print, but these are basically the countries, and then the number of leader terms, and then the time period. So this is all contained in the paper, which actually is forthcoming in Studies in Comparative International Development. It's a special issue that's edited by Ashutosh Varshi. So we're excited about this special issue that's coming out. So this will give you a kind of a snapshot of what it looks like. These are the 10 most populist leaders in the database. So you can see some of the not surprising leaders, such as Vladimir Mečiar, Lukashenko, Erdogan, Václav Klaus, Nikola Gruevski, and then now North Macedonia, right? And then we can also see the 10 most nationalist leaders, right? So you see some of the same names, right? And these are also broken down by leader term as opposed to leader, right? Because we do see a lot of variability over time. So there's some crossover, but not all. So Franjo Tudman actually fairly highly nationalist, but not very highly populist. So we can see a lot of cases where they're actually not, there's a lot of correlation, but it's not perfect. So you do see some highly populist leaders like Mečiar or Klaus that aren't very nationalist, and vice versa, which I think is interesting. This shows basically the 4 types of speeches. So basically each leader term was, the score was an average across 4 types of speeches that were collected in cooperation with the coder team. And so this is basically a quota-based sampling technique that's used, that Hawkins writes about in a CPS article published in 2009. An international speech, a ribbon-cutting speech, a campaign speech, and a famous speech. And we can see that, unsurprisingly, the highest levels of nationalism were seen in the famous speeches. So, the big, kind of like anniversary speeches and the like. That's not that surprising, because you would expect to see kind of references to the nation and protecting the nation and defending against national others or threats to the nation. Whereas with populism, you see the highest amount of populism in the campaign speeches, which shouldn't be that surprising, because obviously these are more likely, populist elements are more likely to show up in political speeches that, surround kind of election campaigns. And both in ribbon cutting and international speeches, you see lower levels of both. There is a correlation, a fairly high correlation between the self and other elements of nationalism, so 0.59, fairly high. And we also see a pretty high correlation, basically half, between populism and nationalism. So they're highly correlated, but they're imperfectly correlated. So this is, I think, interesting to kind of explore the ways in which, you know, where you might see them co-articulated as opposed to articulated separately. And this is sort of the big kind of, you know, surprise finding. I was surprised by it. There doesn't really appear to be a marked increase in either nationalism or populism if you look at the moving average of all of the leader terms in our database, right? You just don't see a whole lot of change, too much. Although it does look, and we see this across also the countries, as if nationalism is kind of, there's been an uptick in nationalist rhetoric in the chief executive speeches since the 2014-15 migration crisis. So you actually do see these a little bit flip in 2014, 2015. But you do see a lot of variation at the sub-regional level. So for example, in Central and Eastern Europe, you see somewhat more populism. We think this has to do with a lot of the Eurosceptic types of politics and also the financial crisis and a lot of these other things that were happening in the mid-2000s. Again, a flipping where you see a more nationalism as opposed to populism, again, after the migration crisis. What's interesting here, and you know, we can only speculate at this point before, you know, without going into the specific cases, is that you actually do see a notable decline in both of these discourses in the post-Soviet region. And we think this might be because neither of these discourses might serve the utilitarian value to competitive authoritarian regimes. So in other words, they might have been used much more frequently before a lot of the regimes have kind of turned towards other strategies of regime legitimation that Grotowski talks about, for example. And then again, a similar sort of picture comes in Southeast Europe as in Central and Eastern Europe. These are a couple of kind of interesting. So this is also kind of shows that most of the West European countries, the chief executives, didn't really show that much nationalism or populism in their speeches. Okay, I'm getting a timeout. So that, I mean, this I think is a big takeaway, that they're really co-articulated far more in Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe and North America. And then final kind of snapshot is just the governments that you can see. I don't know if you can see this. You have like red governments that are basically Eastern Europe, coded with a red dot, and Western Europe and North America with a blue dot. Basically, this is kind of no populism and nationalism, or low levels over here, where most of the Western countries or the Western leaders and leader terms are, as opposed to a few of the ones that are way out, either highly populist, highly nationalist, or both. Are far more likely to be in Eastern Europe and Turkey. So thank you for generously extending some time, and I look forward to reactions.
Thank you, Aron. And Kirk, sorry, I forgot to include you in the list of co-authors there. So next we go to Maria Snegovaya for her presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. My today's presentation actually, I think, fits nicely the previous topic. And I look not specifically at the populist parties, but a broader variety of parties in Europe that can be classified as having pro-Russian attitudes. This is a presentation that's based on two recent publications. The first one has just was published in Party Politics, and a more policy-oriented version of it has been published by the Russia Foundation. Now, what is the reason for the question? Of course, as many of you know, in recent years, the relationship between the EU and Russia has deteriorated significantly. Not going to go into the reasons for this. That's outside of the presentation. But among other things, in order to sort of influence the behavior and policies in the EU, Russia has actively run its influence operations. Some of the parties within the European context actually tend to be quite responsive to Russia's policies and rhetoric. And for simplicity, in this presentation, we call them pro-Russian parties. The question then is to what extent these pro-Russian parties within the European Union, they're truly pro-Russian in their deeply seated, deeply grounded ideology, or it's more of a relationship of what Marlene Lared, for example, calls confluence. So temporary alignment between the interests of the Kremlin and this party's electorates. That's a question that motivates this presentation. Of course, as you know, many of these parties are populist. Many of the parties we think of as being pro-Russian are populist, and therefore I think this is directly in line with today's conversation. So, in other words, the question that I'm trying to ask in this presentation is, are pro-Russian parties in Europe really Trojan horses? So really Russia agents like Trump style, or they're more of fellow travelers? So their alignment of the interest with the Kremlin are only temporary. There's a varieties of analysis on this topic. The primary focus of most of the scholarship that exists on the topic is the radical right or populist radical right. Majority of the studies find that the radical right parties in Europe do have a lot of ideological and intellectual fascination with Putin's Russia, and the similarity of interests lie primarily within the rhetoric of sovereignty, sort of anti-fascism, which is actually questionable because some of these parties can be described as fascist themselves, as well as EU criticism. Similarly, another group of studies focuses on the radical left parties. There, the similarity may have to do with more of the networks established throughout the communist times. The problem with the studies is, first of all, that there is one particular group of parties that tend to be prioritized, the radical populist radical right. The other problem is that most of these parties do not systematically classify pro-Russian parties in Europe. There's actually only three studies that I know of that really systematically do that across the region. And therefore I decided in my work to fill in this gap. So what I do in my paper is I actually consulted a number of experts, established experts on the topic, in order to classify the parties as pro-Russian. The classification criteria was chosen is the party's view on the country's relationship with Russia, sanctions on Russia, specifically with regards to Ukraine, and party links to Russia, direct and indirect. I have consulted a number of experts on the topic, over 10, and only included in my analysis those parties that most of the experts consulted actually agree would classify as pro-Russian, although it's important to acknowledge that there's still, of course, some questions remaining, so it's not set in stone. The resulting classification has 40 parties in 15 member states. I also classified these parties by the ideological party orientations based on the Chapel Hill classification scheme. Here's the result for Western Europe. One thing that stands out here, if you notice, that is actually in line with expectation, majority of these parties do concentrate on the radical right of the political spectrum. From this perspective, it makes sense that majority of parties of studies in Western Europe focus primarily on the radical right. But if you look at the post-communist Europe, the Eastern European side of the story, you notice that that no longer holds true. Here we do find some dominance of pro-Russian parties on both radical right and conservative right, but you do also find those parties on the other side of the political spectrum, granted a little bit fewer than that, but still there's certainly much more ideological variation of these parties across all of the political spectrum. So the result, therefore, is that we've got in Western Europe significant dominance of the radical right parties among those parties that can be classified as pro-Russian. But when it comes to post-communist Europe, there's actually significant ideological variation of these parties. So the question is then, given this ideological heterogeneity, what other similarities do these parties possibly have in common? And that's precisely the question that motivated my research. Specifically, I decided to look at the similarities across these parties' electorates. So what are these possible similarities? Based on existing literature, first of all, we can assume that these parties may be more Eurosceptic. So they're more critical of the EU, and they align naturally with more pro-Kremlin rhetoric, pro-Kremlin policies, because the Kremlin is also like advancing all these anti-EU narratives. There's another possibility, cultural conservatism, right? In this sense, it's possible that the EU, the Center EU, the Western, the Brussels policies often conflict with more conservative orientations of these parties. Maybe that's what these electorates have in common. And ultimately, three, it might be anti-immigration policies. We do know that immigration has become a big topic in Europe. The previous, of course, presentation has covered this issue as well. And it's possible that the Kremlin, being also more critical of the EU immigration policies and overall the situation with immigration, sort of creates this common grounds for alignment. So let's see what actually factors unite the electorates of these parties, if anything at all. Maybe they don't have any similarities whatsoever. So to do that, I compiled data based on the European Social Survey. There was a number of controls included, and I ran a number of regressions. The pooled data set for all of the parties controlling for a fixed year and country effect, as well as separate analysis per country. The European Social Survey data set unfortunately significantly shrinks the data set because it only allows me to include way fewer much lower number of parties. They don't cover all of the parties. Some of them are really not marginal. But overall, I got the data set that includes 7 radical right parties, 5 national conservative parties, 2 center left parties, and 4 radical left parties. And I looked at the predictors of essentially among these factors that I outlined before. So here's the results for Western European data set. Notice that the 3 main hypotheses are on the top of the list. And as you can see, Euroscepticism is one strong predictor of support for this party among its electorates. None of the other factors actually works as well, although the immigration somewhat comes out significant, but only to some extent because the coefficient changes. The only hypothesis here that the variable that returns a consistent and significant coefficient sign is the Euroscepticism. Eastern European sample, pretty much the same story. Euroscepticism comes out significant in all of these cases, but one other variable that's also fairly significant is conservatism. Again, more conservative orientations actually correlate with stronger support for these parties. So overall, what we have here is, first of all, Euroscepticism seems to be a strong predictor for support of pro-Russian, quote-unquote, pro-Russian parties in both East and Western Europe. And this is consistent across the variety of the parties, regardless of their ideological orientations. Conservatism is only significant in post-communist cases, but not in case of Western Europe. Remaining variables do not seem to show a consistent effect. So what does it tell us? First of all, we do find that majority of Kremlin sympathizer parties do have electorates that have some particular similarity. That is, the electorates are significantly more Eurosceptic than mainstream parties in these countries. This is regardless of their ideological leanings and orientations in both Western and Eastern Europe. Second, there's also some hint that this result actually shows us that the nature of the pro-Kremlin alignment of these parties is much more ideological, opportunistic in nature. That is primarily because Euroscepticism is actually a very malleable, unstable feature, and it tends to fluctuate substantially depending on this party's relationship with Brussels. Specifically, if the EU kind of in the recent years, Euroscepticism has been on the rise, but as long as the EU and the center of the EU, the Brussels, is able to figure out the approach that's more less confrontational and is able to essentially make adjustments in its policies, the Eurosceptic this increase in Euroscepticism is likely to disappear. This suggests that the relationship between pro-Russian parties and the Kremlin is likely the relationship of confluence rather than influence, and in the long term, these parties are primarily Kremlin's fellow travelers rather than Trojan horses. Thank you very much.
Maria, thanks so much for that. So let's move into some comments and discussion. So let's go to Angelos first.
Hi, just wanted to really interesting presentations, both of them that we saw. I just wanted to ask Maria, because she was kind of forced, obviously, to run through the last slide, which I think was, I barely got a glimpse of it, and I think it was basically, the so what of the research, which I found really, really interesting, because I often find the conversation about Russian populism to be quite unhelpful, particularly in the policy and journalistic sphere. So just to give you a bit of opportunity, I would like to hear you a bit elaborating a bit on the so what, or kind of, let's say, the policy implications of your very, very interesting analysis. What does that mean? This kind of fellow travelers versus Trojan horses differences sounded very, very fascinating to me. So yeah, just give you an opportunity to expand on that, because I found that very, very interesting.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Angelos, and I'm glad that you found the presentation useful. So yeah, I think the result can be interpreted that there is a underlying reason why specific parties in European Union adopt this more of a pro-Kremlin rhetoric. And this reason has to do with the preferences of the electorates of these parties, right? We notice that regardless of their ideological orientation, the Euroscepticism is what unites these parties' electorates. Therefore, and Euroscepticism, from my perspective, is not some kind of deeply ingrained ideological feature, but rather a sentiment that is quite shallow, and it's responsive to the Brussels policies, the specific relationship between the EU center and the parties in their respective countries. Therefore, I believe this is the core issue that has to be addressed, right? We don't talk here of the deeply ingrained pro-Russian sentiment, and it's not an ideology unlike it used to be, for example, during the communist times, right? In the communist time, the situation was arguably more problematic, given that there was an ideological affinity between the Kremlin, Moscow, communism, and, for example, radical left parties with which Kremlin used to collaborate quite actively. Today, this relationship is one of confluence, one of comfort, one of temporary necessity rather than deeply ingrained ideological relationship. I think this should help us develop ways to sort of address the real grievances that the electorates of these parties have. So, for example, of course, we all know about the constant tensions between the EU and, for example, Hungary, or I don't know, other countries with regards to the immigration policies, with regards to some other issues. Those are much easier to address rather than challenge the deeply held, ideological, say, pro-communist orientations during the Cold War times. So this, I would say, the key takeaway.
Great, thanks, Masha. So now we do have a robust list. So now I'm going to switch format. I'm a very inconsistent moderator, and I'm just going to take a bundle of these questions and comments and try and include as many. And hopefully we'll have some chance for the panelists to respond. So let's start with Allison Carnegie.
Thanks. These are really interesting. For Aron, I was wondering whether you've given some thought to the changing nature of communication over time. So, you're looking at changes in rhetoric over time in these speeches, but I wanted to know if you've thought about how modes of communication over time may impact your analysis. So, for example, the composition of audiences for these speeches has likely changed if there's greater polarization and different sets of people tune in than maybe did before. Or more communication might be done over things like Twitter and social media, and if that affects your analysis.
Super, thank you. Noah Zucker next.
Well, thank you both for very interesting presentations. I have a quick question for Maria. So if I interpreted the argument you make in the paper right, you're basically saying that Euroscepticism is sort of the underlying factor that gives the Kremlin an entry into European political systems. I'm wondering if you see evidence of either there being sort of a feedback loop where Euroscepticism draws the adoption of these or incentivizes the adoption of these pro-Kremlin positions, which then reinforces the Eurosceptical attitudes of party supporters via some elite cues mechanism. Or alternatively, I'm wondering if you've thought about a way of possibly disentangling the Euroscepticism to pro-Kremlin direction from a pro-Kremlin to Euroscepticism direction. If, for instance, for whatever reason, Russia has a particular influence over a given party, elites within that party then start to issue more Eurosceptical, making more Eurosceptical speeches, which then via, again, an elite cues mechanism leads to greater Euroscepticism among the party's members. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Next, I have Hadas.
Thank you. These are great and really relate well to each other. So I have questions for both of you. For Aron, I wonder what is the mechanism there overall? Because for most governments, they don't have, except in maybe the region of the Central European region, they don't have an executive that is populist. So I wonder if, well, nationalism is a different issue. So I wonder if it's just that discourse might have changed, but the executive is not responsive to this change or does not follow up with it, or whether the discourse as a whole hasn't changed and maybe we do see changes in it only after 2015 and the crisis. I'm not sure there's a way to know, but I kind of wonder about that. And to Maria, it's a follow-up question to what Angelos asked, which is, do we see differences in, or do you think your findings matter for policies about Russia? So not just to policies in general, but to policies specifically about Russia.
Thank you, Hadas. Next on the list, I have Richard Clark.
Thanks so much for these interesting presentations. Just a couple questions for Maria. They relate to some of the other things that have been mentioned here. But my question is more, how would we expect this theory, if it does at all, to travel outside of the European context? So for me, the Euroscepticism might be suggestive of anti-Western sentiment more broadly. So it could be like anti-Western bureaucrats and international cooperation more generally, which is sort of what the research we'll be presenting is about. I'm curious, like the Trump context, for instance, Trump rejects Western norms, liberal ideals more generally, and then maybe the Kremlin sees a way in to influence operations there in a similar mechanism to the one that you lay out in the paper. So is it an anti-Western story? Is it an anti-EU story? And potentially if it's an anti-Western story, that may give you a little bit more generalizability, but interesting paper and really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you, Richard. Cameron.
Great, thanks so much. I guess I have more of a comment for Aron. I'm not sure if you've seen, or maybe any of you have seen this paper by David Art in Perspectives on Politics, which he calls the myth of global populism. Essentially, he argues that populism doesn't really give us any value added over nativism, but to the extent I think that nativism and nationalism are closely aligned concepts, I think, Aron, what your paper really does is refute him. So I think that's really interesting that you show that nationalism is not always the thick ideology that pairs with populism, or if it does, it can vary in the extent, right? So I think you've given us a really powerful sort of tool in this to refute these sorts of arguments. Thanks.
Oh, Emily, we can't leave you out. So
I just want to follow off from Cameron's comment, which I thought was really insightful, and sort of linking both Maria and Aron's papers, which I found to have such rich empirical evidence on a topic that I think all of us can agree is treated with not a lot of nuance in general. And, both Aron and Maria are really showing us with their very rich empirical evidence that, populism is not just this one thing. It's a very nuanced it's a very nuanced, set of ideas. And, one thing that, Aron, that really struck me from your slides, it was like, I can't remember if it was the most nationalist or the most populist, but, up high on that list with David Cameron, right? So, that's really interesting. And I wouldn't exactly call David Cameron an anti-Western leader, right? But, that's a very populist message, of course. And so, how that relates to Maria's findings on Euroscepticism is really interesting, and how it just relates to populism as a very broad but necessarily nuanced topic. And I think that's something that all of our papers pick up on, and we can probably talk about in the end as something that stands out to me.
Super, thanks so much. Okay, so let's go actually back to the presenters, and each will have about 6 minutes to address these. So you don't have to take them all, but we do need to keep on the schedule. And let's start with Aron.
So first of all, thank you so much for really interesting questions. I don't know if I'm going to be able to offer great answers to all the questions, or even any of them, but I will try my best. So as to Allison's question about whether or not forms of political communication have changed, and whether this might be a threat, for example, to these measures, I think that's an interesting question. But the short version of this is that we have given a lot of thought as to what sort of role chief executives play in what we're arguing, kind of articulating the sovereign boundaries of the community, right? So identifying the boundaries that essentially sort of encompass the authentic sovereign community, and in the case of populists would exclude elites, in the case of nationalists would exclude national others. So for example, Kertzer calls presidents and prime ministers chief symbol makers of the land, and speeches perform a very important function in essentially projecting this image of this idealized sovereign community. And so while it's true that forms of political communication have changed over time, what we have done is try to develop a database of essentially the same sort of units of analysis to try to see whether within this form of communication, which is so important to establishing this idealized bounded community, whether or not there actually has been some changes over time. And it looks like on aggregate, it hasn't really, but if you bear down into the specific regions, you do see a lot of very interesting variation. I think a lot of that gets to the reasons that Maria has identified, that there are really different politics that are occurring in these countries. And here I want to just jump down to Emily's point about David Cameron being kind of a surprising as someone who sort of pops up as a relatively populist leader. I think what was interesting for us was to see how little populism there was across sort of Western leaders. And I think so much of this is probably because the countries themselves are so highly integrated into international structures. This type of populist rhetoric tends to be anti-establishment, and it tends to be, again, mostly focused on Europe, on basically power holders, which in Europe would be basically Brussels, a troika. You would have different types of elites. In Latin America, it typically is focused on Washington, right? So this is sort of how to interpret this in context, in regional context. As to Hadas's question about the mechanism, this sort of goes beyond the speech database and links up with various sort of theoretical contributions and different kind of like case specific treatments of populism and nationalism. I think that typically populism emerges in the wake of crises of political crises, so party scandals, sort of financial crises, anything that can sort of pop the bubble of sort of public confidence in in political institutions. So by contrast, nationalism, this is particular as kind of exclusionary ethno-nationalism, is more aligned with or comes more often in the wake of perceived crises of national sovereignty. So any type of war situation, either internal or external. So this is why, for example, Poroshenko actually scores fairly high on nationalism, but not at all on populism. The same with Franjo Tudjman, the same with Shargzian in Armenia. Right, these are basically measured at a time when there's extensive international tensions, where nationalist discourse in these contexts are used to essentially stitch together the entire national community united against this external national threat. And you do see this in Western Europe. You see this discourse much more, again, commonly in Western Europe than you see populism, right? And this populist nationalist kind of co-articulation much more likely in countries of, on the European periphery, where in Klaus' office terms, they're characterized by the crises of triple transition, in the 90s, and this is no less real today. Thank you, Cameron, for the great. I haven't actually read this, but this will definitely come in handy. This art piece. I think I'll stop there. Thanks, guys.
Great, thank you, Masha. Over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really interesting, engaging conversation, and I'm glad there's a lot of positive feedback. I do believe, by the way, Emily, on your point about the future, issue, there's actually some extension of the work obvious here. For example, there might be case studies looking at how these Russian parties leverage the Russianness in order to get some favors from the EU, in line with suggestions by Noah, for example. So I'll try to answer quickly. Noah, this is an excellent question. On your precisely demand to try to show this cycle between Euroscepticism and pro-Russianness, one thing that comes to mind is, for example, Orban's ability to leverage his Russia association to get more favors and independence from Brussels, for example, as one clear demonstration of that. However, the problem with showing the link until recently, disentangling more specifically pro-Russianness from Euroscepticism was problematic given the lack of this data in the survey. But the latest edition of Chapel Hill that came out, unfortunately, after I already submitted the paper, they actually might be allowing to do that because there's a separate variable on Russian interference there. But it's going to be only for 1 year, but it's still possible to look to what extent that variable actually has a separate effect from Euroscepticism. We're hoping to do that in the extension of this project with Aron Buzagani. So hopefully I will have more to say in a little bit on this issue. Thank you for excellent question. To Hadas, about how the fact that we know that this finding, how it's going to influence the EU-Russia policy. I think it's a very important question. And one thing I didn't have time to mention in my presentation is that actually there's a very direct application of this finding in pro-Russian policy of the EU. If you remember, when Russia invaded Ukraine, in EU imposed the sanctions, there was a lot of skepticism about longer-term sustainability of these sanctions. A lot of people said, the EU members gonna totally be split on this issue, and they're not going to be able to continue these policies. And it does sound true, because these pro-Russian parties, when they come to power, I know the common example would be Greece, for example, they always state that the Russian sanctions should be abolished. They have no go. But then as they continue in power, they end up embracing the EU status quo, and the resulting EU policy on Russia ended up being quite more robust when it comes to sanctions. You can argue sanctions are not strong enough, but they are there, and they're long-term, they're sustainable. That's one clear implication, for example, of these policies, I think, of this finding. I think the EU actually can afford a much tougher Russia policy than it believes it can, precisely because this is a relationship of confluence, again citing Marlene Rayleigh, rather than influence. And ultimately, Richard, very good point about Trump. I think the finding is applicable to other regions as well, except that, of course, we're talking less of Euroscepticism, say, in the American and the US context, right? But more of other kind of anti-globalization, like orientation of, say, Trump, that made him more likely to get aligned with the Kremlin. I think in the long term, it becomes more obvious that Trump was less of the real Russia agent and more of this, again, typical populist leader with, again, with short-term interest to re-engage Russia. And by the way, he also failed in those attempts precisely for the reason I think what my paper shows. It demonstrates the longer term interests actually still do not necessarily align. The long-term ideological interests, even of populist radical right parties, are a little bit different from the pro-Kremlin longer-term ideological orientations. It's a short-term relationship. But I do believe there's actually a lot of ground for further extension of this findings and trying to essentially operationalize this short-term confluence of interests, one of the possible extensions of the paper. Thank you for your excellent suggestions.
Next up, we have the effects of populism on foreign policy. And our first presenter is Angelos Chryssogelos. What does populism mean for foreign policy?
Thanks, Alex. And if I may say, I'll start by giving you the award of the best non-Greek person pronouncing my name. That was indeed so substantially impressive, I must say. I don't have a PowerPoint because I find that actually PowerPoint makes me talk longer than what I usually do. In a sense, I will just go through actually two pieces of work that I'm currently involved in. One is a collaborative work. It's a special issue that me and a number of other people have been working on. Aron is actually involved in that as well. We are looking at populist foreign policies, but with particular focus on what was actually done in real life, right? By looking at what populist governments have done in Europe in recent years. We've had among, I guess, one silver lining is that in Europe in recent years, we actually have had populists in power. Therefore, a lot of the kind of speculative things that we've been talking about for quite a few years, discussing about populism and foreign policy was really just about going through programmatic positions, many of them often really loose, very unstructured. But now we actually have some data points that we can look at about what populists are doing in power. The second, which leads me to the second piece of work, I think I'm just sharing it now, hopefully you will see it in the chat, is a policy brief that I just published with Chatham House. And I'm not sharing it for self-promotion, but more because it's, in a way, it's just an effort for me to summarize a lot of work of what others have done and what we are looking at, that special issue about what is the effect of populism on foreign policy. So it's probably a simple read, I would say. So anyone interested in having an overview of this stuff, feel free to have a look. So first of all, what we're looking at this special issue, in a way, is that we are trying to categorize the impact of populists in power on foreign policy along certain dimensions, along some specific questions. So we are basically asking if we really observe in real life a lot of things that we have been theorizing for a while that we think that populists do bring about on foreign policy. So those things include diversification of foreign policy relationships. So do we see populists being much more voluntaristic, much more adventurous in looking for new foreign policy relationships, perhaps going beyond institutionalized relations within the Euro-Atlantic framework? And by the way, our focus is exclusively on Europe, right? So I should say that from the beginning. We're looking at patterns of politicization. So are populists more prone to politicize foreign policy, right? To perhaps use it more explicitly, more shamelessly, if you want, for domestic purposes. Again, this is something that we usually expect. Are populist foreign policies more aggressive, more bellicose, more anti-institutionalist, more sovereigntist, as we are usually come to expect. And finally, in terms of the process, the procedure of foreign policy, which we often don't talk about much, but I would argue perhaps is something that we should be looking at more. Do populists in power affect the foreign policy making process, the way that foreign policy institutions work? And I think perhaps those of you in the United States have spent much more time talking about it over the last 4 years, where I would argue, based on my very very kind of superficial knowledge of the Trump, following the Trump administration, seems to me that perhaps the institutions of foreign policy making was in itself even more revolutionary than his actual actions and the actual content of his policies in terms of a departure from previous patterns. So this is what some of the things that I think we need to be looking at. And I think particularly the main comparative question here is, if we really want to start establishing the discrete impact of populists, is to actually think to what extent populism really differs from non-populists in power, right? This is the actual hard question that I think we should be looking at if we really want to substantiate the impact of populists. So I try to give a bit of an overview dash answer to this in my research paper, and then now I'm shifting to what I am saying. I don't want it to sound like this is the answer that the special issue as a whole gives, but looking particularly at countries like Hungary, Poland, Italy, and Greece, countries where we did have populists in power who also were quite active in the foreign policy field. So I think my overview shows that basically there are two ways that we can look at that, and those two ways actually carry conceptual implications also about how we think about populism as a concept and as a phenomenon and what it means. One way that we can think about it is if we actually have a very kind of positivist kind of, think A draws an arrow leading to think B kind of way of viewing things with populism. And I think in this respect, my own argument is, what I find is that actually populism doesn't really change all that much, at least based on what I have seen in Europe. In terms of strictly speaking, new foreign policies, country A was doing A for a long time, but then under a populist government, it changes completely to doing something B. You actually very rarely see that. In that respect, populists appear to be much more beholden to the geopolitical limitations and the geoeconomic limitations on their countries, as well as the dominant strategic traditions of their countries. And actually, that should actually make sense to the leading also to the debate about populism and nationalism that Aron gave us, right? Because in some way, particularly right-wing populists tend to be also very nationalist. In that sense, you would actually expect them to double down on some of the dominant national traditions of their foreign policies instead of going against them. In that respect, it's actually left-wing populists who may appear much more willing to go against traditional nationalistic understandings of the national interest. On the other hand, however, left-wing populists themselves are a source of continuity, because by being internationalists, they are also much more easier to find peace, as it were, with international institutions that they are part with. And this is a pattern that we see both with Syriza and Podemos, who have really accommodated to the European mainstream in recent years much more easily. So if we're looking at that, I'm not sure that we are able to say a very interesting story, but all of us here really know, it's in our gut, right, that populism does make a difference in a certain way. We do know that, you may still want the same thing, but you may want it in a different way, right? You may still say it in a different way. And I think in this respect, this opens up to the question about how is it that we understand populism. I think foreign policy analysis has latched a lot on the dominant mainstream perspective on the study of populism, which is about the ideational perspective of populism, which again is much more kind of ontologically independent. It's populism is something that exists in a way, therefore it leads to specific outcomes. But I would like to say that I think there is a way, if we think about populism in a more critical political perspective, in a kind of as a discourse or a way of speaking, this is no less important than the actual impact of populism on practical policies. Again, drawing on Aron's work, you may still follow pretty much the same foreign policy in terms of actual policies, but the way you articulate it, you may be articulating it in a way that articulates in a very significant way the limits of the political community, the terms of belonging between the political community and the state, what the state stands for. All right, you know, take Austria for example. I mean, we know Austria is one of the most pro-Russian, quote-unquote, countries in the EU. I mean, for reasons of history, for reasons of national interest, it is closer to Russia than the EU average, as it were. But we do know this is different when a center-right or a center-left party of Austria try to have some openings to Russia while trying to engage with the EU, versus the far-right populists of Austria, who actually present the relations with Russia as a way to emancipate themselves from the EU. Right? The policy in practice may be the same. The articulation is quite different. So, finishing off, what is the theoretical insight of that, and what would be the theoretical kind of added value of incorporating more critical perspectives in the study of populism, and therefore in the study of populism of foreign policy? I think the question that opens up here is really to what extent populism is really a force of change, and how a substantially re-articulated foreign policy, what does it really mean about the relationship between the state and society, and the ability of the state to domesticate and incorporate a domestic society? We could perhaps say that populism is, in a way, the midwife of a new equilibrium between state and domestic society under severely changing international conditions, whereby the actual absence of actual policy change, the actual absence of actual policy change actually points to a substantial continuity in the ways that the state pursues its interest. However, it does that under substantially different terms, and I would argue it also raises important questions to what extent populism is really representative for forces of change in a society.
Terrific, thanks so much. And now for a related take on similar question, Jean-Christophe Boucher and Cameron Thies, how populism shapes foreign policy. Floor is yours.
Our paper does flow quite nicely, actually, from Angelos's. So it's almost like someone designed this program purposely.
You got this? Does this work?
Yes, perfect. Okay,
all right.
I guess you can advance to the next slide.
Of course I can.
So basically, our research question is looking at what factors enable populist governments to adopt specific foreign policy positions. It relates to a question that's come up time and again in this discussion, is just because you're a populist doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to end up adopting populist policies. So we want to know what makes the connection between populist issues and populist policies, right? And when we started working on this paper, which I think, I don't know, it seems like a really long time ago, but it was in the before times, most of the work done on populism and foreign policy tend to be case-based, or if you got generalization, it was more Western, there's Western European folks, and then there's the Latin American folks, and the two didn't really connect well. So we were sort of aiming to try to generalize more broadly to see, are there things that connect all populists, and do some kind of a larger sort of quantitative analysis, not super large N, as you'll see, which is somewhat limiting in what we can do in terms of the quantitative part of this. But it's an attempt, I think, to be more general. And in so doing, think more broadly about how populism shapes world politics. So we adopt the sort of ideational approach, which you're all well familiar with, so I won't go through that in any detail. We do think in foreign policy in particular, there is this added dimension that the populist leader who is identifying dangerous others is also identifying who that dangerous other is in the external environment, not just internally who the enemy might be, but externally as well. we try to ground kind of our theoretical approach and our identification of populist issues in sort of broader challenges to the liberal international order. We certainly recognize that not all populists challenge the liberal international order, but we do think that's kind of a common feature of this contemporary kind of resurgence of populism. And so we focus on three kind of key issues: the movement of people, the movement of goods, and the protection of state autonomy. The first two are probably relatively straightforward, but by protection of state autonomy, we mean sort of the growth of international institutions, and particularly their intrusion into domestic politics. And the fact that many populists sort of don't like this, right? Just as they don't like, sort of free trade or unfettered immigration as well. So we look to what might be the more general determinants of populist foreign policy issues and populist actual adoption of populist foreign policies. One that recurs frequently in the literature is partisanship, reflecting a broader kind of left-right ideology. And so we have a couple of hypotheses relating right and left-wing governments to these issues. Right-wing governments are more likely to adopt a nativist anti-migrant position. Left-wing populist governments are more likely to adopt a protectionist stance on trade. And that's basically drawing on what sort of seems to be the general inclination from the literature thus far, what we'll test more generally. And then we also think there are a lot of political opportunity arguments out there about the kinds of factors about the political system, for example, that enable populists to enact populist foreign policies. So for example, we think presidential systems provide much more leverage for the executive than parliamentary systems. So we think across the board, a presidential populist is more likely to be able to adopt these nativist anti-migrant positions, protectionist anti-trade positions, and also to try to reduce the influence of international institutions as well. And a second sort of political opportunity argument relates to the power sharing structure. So again, we think unified populist governments are more likely to have more leverage as well on sort of migration, trade, and sort of reclaiming sovereignty from international institutions, right? So we're making sort of kind of basic, I think, fundamental arguments about what enables populists to adopt populist foreign policy positions. They may seem rather simple, but we thought this is a good place to start with sort of a sort of simple understanding of the way populists may be enabled to enact these sort of populist foreign policies.
All right, so I guess, all right, so I mean, one of the big questions, I think Angelos kind of set this stage for us, kind of saying like, on the one hand, we haven't seen a lot of these populist governments actually, leading the executive. So the implications for foreign policy has always been kind of theoretical, but never kind of really measured in a substantive way. One of the major problems that we have, and I think Angelos said this, and I think he's right, is that we've seen a lot of ranges of different kinds of policy positions, especially on foreign policy, from different kinds of populist governments. And one of the things we're trying to understand is there, we shouldn't assume necessarily that all populist governments will do X and Y. There's probably things that influence their capacity or their willingness to kind of move and do these kinds of things. And if we can understand better the impact of partisanship and the relationship between thin and thick ideologies, if we can think about like the kind of institutional constraints of these governments when they come into power, and Angelo said it, then we might have a better understanding of the connection between populism and certain kinds of foreign policy positions and behaviors of these governments. So what we've done is we've essentially tried to collect a data set on all populist governments' terms between 2000 and 2019, using mostly the populist way of doing it and the Chapel Hill data set. It's not a complete comprehensive data set, mostly because we have limited understanding of Asian populist governments. We have like limited understanding of African populist government, and we would like eventually to kind of expand the data set. But having Aron on the call, I know that she knows how difficult it is to just do the European countries. Expanding this to the African and Asian, that's a major undertaking. So we've essentially kind of built a regression model. One of the reasons why we actually kind of kept ourselves like simple in terms of numbers of independent variables was basically because since there's so low, like 64 country or populist terms, we couldn't add a lot of independent variables, which essentially brings down the level of power. All right, so the dependent variables, we essentially built two dependent variables, one looking at discourses of these governments and one looking at policy and action. So essentially decisions to do something. And we've built essentially three dependent variables, one promoting autonomy or sovereignty toward international actors, one making the promotion of nativist, anti-immigrant foreign policy agenda, and one promoting protectionism. And we've went into the data set and essentially collected all these cases and asked our coders to look into these terms and seeing whether or not they could find yes or no, 1 or 0, if we can find elements of the government making clear, legal or regulatory instruments to restrict, immigration, protectionism, or to scale back relationship with the international system. In terms of independent variables, we had 3. Actually, initially we had 5 or 6, but at one point we decided about 64 cases. That became kind of a problem. So we've looked into left-right ideological leaning. We think that does a lot of the work in the kind of combination with populism with these ideological leaning. We've looked at political system, presidential versus parliamentary. We used the World Bank database to do this. And then we looked at the political power sharing structure, whether or not, the government had 50% of legislative members, part of the presidential political party, which allows the government to enact policies when they want. And these are the kinds of results that we're getting. So on nativism, on anti-immigration, what we're getting, and we did like a Login and OLS model. On nativism and populism, what we're seeing is roughly a kind of, at least intuitively, the kinds of things we're expecting. Right-wing populist parties have a tendency to enact anti-immigrant policies. If you look into we did the average marginal effect, and it's basically, right-wing populist parties are 24% more likely to put in place restrictions on immigration. One of the interesting part that we had was on the presidential variable, where here you see parliamentary system are actually more likely to put in place those kinds of things, which actually kind of made us think about how, especially right-wing parties in a parliamentary system needs to find ways to increase their coalition building. They often will, create relationship with far-right nativist parties, which are usually focusing on these immigration issues, and they start to talk about these issues a lot more. Oops. On protectionism, what we're getting is roughly what we were expecting. Left-wing parties are more likely to put in place both a discourse and a protectionist policy. And of course, unified governments have a tendency to do this. They have the capacity to put in place these policies. And thirdly, on sovereignty, we see here that left-wing parties have a tendency to put in place or restrictions or to reduce their the intergovernance or global interactions. This is counterintuitive in my head. here we also see that, you know, presidential parties have a tendency to do this, and unified governments. So what do we have? So in terms of trying to think about how, like, the variance of all of these populist parties putting in place foreign policy, we think that sometimes maybe we assume that populism will do most of the traction and most of the effect, whereas you have to think of this as a more holistic view of there's different kinds of reasons that affects their capacity to enact these kinds of policies. What we know, and that seems to be verified in all the studies that I've seen in the last couple of years, is that left-wing, right-wing parties' ideology makes a lot of those influence. And political opportunity also seems to affect the capacity of these governments to put in place certain kinds of policies. More broadly, I think it shapes a little bit an assumption on, at least what we're seeing is that they're populist governments who come into power have a tendency to push back at least certain parts of what we assume is the core tenets of the liberal world order, the free movement of people, especially for right-wing populist parties, the free movement of good, especially for the left-wing populist parties, and in some cases push back against the institutionalization of international governance, which speaks about the kind of challenges to the international system writ large. Have I overshot my 10 minutes?
It's okay. We're all good. So let's get the list going on this important.
Also empirically, doing those tests might also just give you a bit more statistical power, which could help refine the results. But very interesting papers both. Thanks.
Thank you. Allison.
Thanks. I really enjoyed both of these papers. Just a quick question for Cameron. I thought the sort of headline finding was really interesting, but I was sort of curious why you also were testing your sort of sub hypotheses related to the presidential system versus parliamentary system. In particular, what is specific about that to populism? So we'd expect that it's the case that any leader would be more constrained depending on their political opportunity, right? So I'm just wondering why those findings would relate specifically to populism.
Great, thanks. Maria?
Yep, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, Angelos. You definitely resonated with mine, a lot of your points. But I wanted to, my question is actually to Jean, Christophe, and Cameron. So you, in your hypothesis, you kind of theoretically separate between anti-immigrant and protectionist stances. While in recent years, a lot of scholars talk about the emergence of so-called economic nationalism as this, in the unified term for particular populist right, parties in power, which really refers to both, to the combination of policies that at the same time, the protection is both culturally and economically. So my question is, to what extent it's, this is a term specifically was applied in the post-communist context, but my question is to what extent it's useful to them methodologically to distinguish between culturally protectionist anti-immigrant and economically protectionist policies when scholars increasingly talk of parties that actually combine both of them together. Thank you.
Thank you. Hadas?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for both of these. These are great. And well, you will see when we present ours that it's very much connected to our paper as well. I also have a question for Jean, Christophe, and Cameron, which is, it's connected to what Maria just said, but kind of the opposite. So I think that, so there is, I agree that there is economic protectionism, but I actually think there might be trade-offs between different types of economic protectionism. And there's a very interesting work on immigration that shows that in some cases where there is more, when there is, enough outsourcing, then you don't need labor migration. And so there are more pressures to, or governments can accept the pressures to stop immigration more easily. But what I wonder, and I'll send a link for this, but what I wonder is something a little different, which is two things. One, I feel like there might be a regional issue here, which is that in Europe and the United States, immigration is much more of an issue, whereas in other areas it's just not, and I wonder how that plays out. And similarly with protectionism, which is something that we look at the international position of your state and how much it allows you to have protectionism anyway, because obviously European states are much more limited in their ability to do that, whereas Latin American states, their economy is different, so they're much more able to do that. So yeah, this were my 2 points. Thanks.
Okay, great. So there's a lot on the table, and would like to give just the bare minimum amount of time to each group to address this. So let's go 5 minutes each. Let's start with Angelos.
There weren't any questions directed towards me, actually. So I think probably Cam and no, it's fine, no worries. But probably Cam and JC will need more time to answer the stuff that were directed at them. So they can, and if anything pops up that I want to comment on, comment on their comments, and I can do that later.
Thank you. The collective thanks you. Let's go to Cameron and John.
JC, do you want to start?
Sure. All of these are super good questions, and at one point we had those kinds of questions ourselves, and somehow we kind of decided to go left instead of right. And now, of course, we always think about like whether or not that was a good reason or not. The populist versus Noah's question, we thought about this a lot, and at one point, one of the issue we had was then like, okay, so how many non-populists we would add, right? So we're thinking in terms of populist government. So every time there's a term of a populist government, then we actually code this as an event. That would mean we would have to kind of code non-populist, like term government before, I'm guessing, and after. And then we were starting to see like, so we were starting to see the data set kind of grow really fast on us in different ways that would make this interesting. And then we were wondering, like, should we do this? But then we end up probably with a big data set with zeros and a little data set with which we could work statistically. And we were thinking about that. It's just I'm reluctant to go see my students and saying like, okay, now we have to code 2,000 new cases because we have to, and then like how much before, how much after, like there's a lot of kind of methodological questions on what would make sense in that case. For sure, this is kind of a selecting on the depend variable, saying like what we're looking at is really like the kinds of policies that they put in place more so than whether or not it's a populist versus non-populist government. What we're trying to understand is whether or not they put in place protectionist policies or not. Do they put nativist anti-immigration policies or not? Do they challenge international governance or not? And then we kind of go from there. So I don't think it contradicts the argument that we could compare non-populist and populist government, but at least in our case, we're saying like, what are the factors that kind of like allows us to understand and somewhat, like, or expect the kinds of policies that we would see from these kinds of government. Is there a different, that would be kind of my argument. I'm still challenged and upset about this. And I'm still kind of trying to think about ways that I could like spend a lot of money kind of doing those kinds of things on the side. If that makes any sense. It's a bigger, like, this is like not marginal. It would create a massive data set that I don't know anyone has, or I would be interested to see if maybe Aron like looks at me. So maybe she says like, oh, we're thinking about building that kind of data set. But that would be interesting. So why the sub hypotheses? And that could, like, that feeds into Allison's question, which I think is a good one. I think like, our problem was really our assumption that, we're trying to understand when we have a populist government, what kind of policies the foreign policies are they putting in play or not? And my basic assumption, our basic assumption was that there's some kind of mix of things with populism that allows them to do it or not. And in this case, I think having a much more holistic view of the kinds of reality that these populist governments are living in allows us to understand why they're doing some kinds of things or not. I think you're right. It doesn't change from non-populist government, and the kinds of assumptions that we have are the same that we have for any kind of governments. I don't think I've answered your question as well as I wish I did, And I see the kind of like, we're interested in the kind of the impact of the international system. Why are you doing this, all this like domestic, foreign policy thing? And I think it's because I'm a foreign policy scholar, so I think about these like kind of like how the domestic environment shapes the policies that these governments put in play or not. And it's not as well connected as I wish it was. Protectionism versus nativism. Cameron, do you want to stop me or do you let me go?
I mean, I think this is a fascinating question, and it had not ever occurred to me. I don't know if it ever occurred to you, JC, but
no.
I think we could probably code when these things are connected, right? When leaders specifically talk about them as being connected. So I think that's an excellent suggestion, and it just had not really occurred to me before in that way. But I think that's really useful. Regional issues, yeah, I mean, again, I think we stumbled into this thinking we were going to be the generalizers, right? So we didn't want to replicate sort of these sort of regional islands of theory and evidence that we're developing. But I guess, I mean, we could easily control for region.
It's actually the data set.
Yeah. So
but it's always like when you have 64 cases and you're doing statistical, analysis, adding more variables then means that you're going deeper into problems. One of the things that people are upset about this paper is that, there are so little cases that they say like it should be like now populism, like the way I see this is that we have enough populist governments now to kind of create the hope that we can generalize better than we used to. And we're moving into a territory where we're quantifying more and more these kinds of things. But in terms of numbers of N, we're still kind of in the low level 64, which is not a lot, which makes all statistical inference kind of hard to do. And kind of, you have to scale back your ambition to add a lot of things to the model because then things become unwieldy. 64 cases too big. We tried to keep QCA on this. It was terrible. And there was so many paths to that it didn't work. And it was crazy. So we said like, okay, we can't do a QCA. This is not a comparative because there's too many cases. So it's a weird kind of middle ground where there's not enough cases, but there's enough of them to kind of start to make inferences about what we think would happen.
Maybe back to the original question about populist versus non-populist. What would you think if we just built out the countries that we know had populist leaders and compared, we do basically within country comparisons to non-populists? I mean, also cross-case comparisons as well, but would that universe of cases be enough for a comparison?
I don't know. It's kind of an interesting question. Like we're struggling with this all the time. The problem we have is that some of them kind of are weird, right? Like Turkey is a good example, right? So in the populist data set, Turkey is not coded as a populist government. In the first, like the Erdogan's first mandate is not. And then slowly but surely, he starts to get into that. So that makes it kind of weird. Some of the countries, the terms are super small. And then they overlap with kind of like non-populist and then populist, and like I think in Macedonia and all of these kind of countries where, and that become like I start to kind of count them. It's like, whoa, we need a lot of work to do these kinds of mini, like 6 months of this and 3 months of that, and then this is a non-populist. This is a it was a lot harder than I thought it would. Like theoretically sounds like easy to do, like non-pop, but specifically in the data set, it becomes really, really interesting. Yeah, Emily, yeah, okay, yeah, so it is, right? Like when you start to do that, like, whoa, like it's harder than we think. So that's why we kind of scale it back, say like let's think in terms of the kinds of assumptions we have about these populist governments. We think that they're going to be protectionist sometimes. We think that they're going to be, no. We think that they're going to be nativist sometimes. So can we find evidence that that's actually true beyond the kind of case-by-case basis. And I like the kind of questions about, like, you know, I'm surprised that Angelos went into like the Laclau kind of critical discourse kind of thing, right? Because in the grand scheme of things, I was expecting him to be an ideational guy, but really the assumption here, and I think he's
everything.
right, is that
I'm everything to everyone, JC.
I mean, I have the assumption, like what I like about the ideational part is that, you know, in terms, and we get this sometimes with some of the work we have, people say, like, is there a difference between, you know, like ideology as ideas or ideology as issue position? And some people assume that having an ideology is having certain kinds of issue positions. From an ideational part, we can start to say, like, you know, we can have different governments having the same kind of policy position, but the way they understand these policy positions are different. In the case of populism, we can actually think about how nativism for a populist government is kind of the intersection between nationalism and populism, and how the construction of the other is defined as a nation. And that kind of becomes the kind of interesting mix that produces these kinds of policy positions. But we're still struggling. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, John. Christophe, I'm gonna cut you off just because we're almost at time, and I do want to give Angelos a chance to give his commentary on anything that's happened here.
No, I mean, I don't really, I don't have a commentary. Probably I just catch on the last point by JC, which is that, yeah, different understandings of populism really may lead you into different ways of asking those questions. It seems to me that we're asking the same questions, really. Probably, I don't think necessarily that even the actual what question will, you know, be different, because obviously, you know, empirical research will just show you what's out there. Perhaps though, I think different theoretical traditions may lead to a different "so what" question, right? So which was kind of a bit because the meta question about what are kind of the normative democratic implications that we're discussing here, which is also what I touched upon on my presentation. But I think having all those perspectives side by side to each other, and also talking about further collaborations here, I think is a very fruitful way moving forward.
Excellent. So I think we will wrap up this particular session here, then go to our third segment, moving up in scale, populism and global politics. And our first paper comes from our co-hosts, Hadas and Emily, All Bark, No Bite, Systemic Analysis of Populism and Foreign Policy.
Thank you. I'll share my screen in a minute, which is mostly pictures because these are case studies. So it's just for you to enjoy some pictures while we speak. But I do want to note that when we started working on this paper, which was when I was born, I think, we started with a lot of cases, with actually 8 cases from different regions, because we had the same thought that Cameron and JC had, which is that we don't want to do something very specific. And we started with comparative cases of populists and non-populists from around the world in recent years. It was just so long that we decided that this will be great for a book, but we just can't hold this comparison together. So I really appreciate what you're doing there. And we decided to limit our discussion to the European Union, but we are interested in the same questions as you'll see. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so so is there such a thing as a populist foreign policy? And we also went to both the literature and a lot of the popular discourse on it, which has several key assumptions in it. And again, this doesn't actually include the literature that we see here today that is much more nuanced. But in the past, and especially in popular discourse, there are a few assumptions. First of all, protectionism, as we said, anti-immigration, and for security issue, it's a little bit more complicated, which is, on the one hand, there is an assumption of isolationism, but on the other hand, there is an assumption that because of this wild rhetoric of populists, they might be more prone to accidental conflict or to different types of conflict. And the other issue that there are some assumptions on is alliances, or more like collaboration, which is something that Maria talked about, the assumption that they will align with non-traditional actors or with non-traditional, make friends or with like-minded populists. So what we wanted to see was whether these stand when there are actual populists in government. And I do want to say that we put Trump here because I think that these assumptions come from three main places. First of all, the populist rhetoric, which is very vocal and very colorful and wild and easy to quote. Second, notable cases like the case of Donald Trump that made a lot of noise for all of us. And lastly, I also think that populists ultimately get elected because of all kinds of social pressures that include also pressures for more protectionism. And so the assumption is that there will be more protectionism when they come to government. So we came up with a theory because what we assumed is actually that they don't do many of these things because they have constraints. And unlike the previous paper that we just saw, we looked at international constraints rather than domestic constraints, and we do acknowledge that there are domestic constraints, but we held them constant through our case studies and did not look at them in this paper, but only at international constraints. And so we looked at different policy areas, and we said in areas where there is very high interdependence, where states are very dependent on other states in a way that will not allow them to replace what they get from the international system or from the European Union in this case, then we actually don't expect to see a different foreign policy for populists than we do for non-populists. When interdependence is a little lower, when they have some kind of a choice, certainly not on trade issues in the European Union, but on other issues, then we think it depends how important the policy is for security and prosperity. If it's very important, then we still don't expect them to have a uniquely populist foreign policy because they're not crazy for the most part, and they need to get re-elected. They have a base and they need to satisfy this base, and they don't want to hurt very crucial core interests. When policy area is less important for security and prosperity, then we expect a specific kind of foreign policy, of populist foreign policy, which we term as DTFP, domestically targeted foreign policy. And what we mean by that is what we often identify with populists, those very usually symbolic, very, very visible policies, very, again, notable but not important. And we go over these in our case studies. So, no, yes. Okay, so these are our expectations. We look at 2 sets of case studies instead of 8. And these are, we look at populist and non-populist case in the case of Hungary and Croatia. And of course, it's a question whether Croatia is entirely non-populist, but it's certainly not as populist as Hungary. And they do share a lot of core interests because of their geopolitical position and because of similar economic conditions. And we also look at Hungary and Poland on an issue that they don't share core interest on, which is they all share the core interest of having a secure energy stream, but they don't share the methods, the right methods, because they don't share geopolitical and infrastructure in this case. So we wanted to look whether they do or do not share policies as a result. So let me go over the Hungarian case briefly. We do see that for the most part, Hungary was a rather compliant actor internationally. And we actually looked at a whole variety of measures. Some of them are in this version of the paper and some are not in this version of the paper. They vote in the UN like the rest of Europe, and like Croatia, they did not change their trade policies and they did not really change their investment policies either. And they did do certain things that we do want to talk about, which we think are DTFPs on issues that are less important, which is that, sorry, I want to open the chat so I can see the 5 minutes. Okay, so here's, by the way, a picture of the auto industry, because we wanted to note that on issues that are very important, like the industry in the Hungarian case, the industry in Hungary is very, very foreign, very, very German, actually, specifically. And they certainly did not do anything to curtail in any way investment in those areas. On the contrary, they lowered their business tax rate, and they did all kinds of things to attract foreign investors. But they had a rhetoric of pushing away foreign investors, and they did do that in specific areas, in areas that are very important to populists, but not very important to the economy, like the media. Which is something that, of course, is extremely important for populists to curb the media. So they did replace foreign ownership of media through direct and specific taxation. And so we define these exactly. It's not that these are entirely unimportant, but it's a trade-off that populists make, and they decided it's important enough for their agenda, but not that important for core interest. And this is where we think we'll find those foreign policies that are specifically populist. I want to note one more thing, which is the immigration policy. We go over several things that they did do. Immigration policy is an interesting one. This is assigned in Hungarian, and I will tell you what it says in a minute, but I think the interesting part is that who is this targeting? You don't know what it says, and certainly immigrants don't know what it says. So the audience for this are certainly neither certainly neither the immigrants nor the international community. It's only for Hungarians, and that's what we mean by domestically targeted policies. This sign says, immigrants, if you're coming to Hungary, don't take Hungarian jobs. Don't steal Hungarian jobs. And that, of course, only speaks to Hungarians. And let me pass this to Emily, that will talk about our other case study.
So very briefly, we also compare populist Hungary and populist Poland on the issue of energy security. Those of you who know me know that my PhD dissertation is about this, and poor Alex was forced to read many, many versions of this as my dissertation advisor. But in brief, Hungary and Poland, both under very populist governments, chose completely different paths to energy security. Viktor Orban chose to increase energy linkages to Russia, both by elongating and extending the natural gas contract with Russia's Gazprom, and by agreeing to sign a contract for Rosatom, which is the Russian state nuclear agency, to build a nuclear facility. Completely funded by a Russian loan, right? So rather than pursuing a path of energy independence and security and energy nationalism, Orban chose to increase linkages to Russia, and this was partially due to Orban's electoral message of social affordability of utilities, right? So one of his main electoral platforms was social affordability of utilities. And in order to achieve that policy-wise, one way to do that was to just double down on energy linkages to Russia. On the other hand, of course, Poland chose a completely opposite way of pursuing their energy security. They are, of course, one of the most vocal critics of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And they really led the charge against what they saw as, nefarious Russian control of the European energy industry through a number of ways. So, they announced their intention, the populist government announced their intention not to renew their long-term contract with Gazprom, and instead to turn towards diversification as a strategy. Part of that was negotiations with Donald Trump to bring U.S. liquefied natural gas to Poland to replace lost Russian volumes, and also increased cooperation with Lithuania to pursue liquefied natural gas as a way of turning against Russia. And really, this is about the security interests of the state. Obviously, Poland has a long history of anti-Russian rhetoric, and the populist government in Poland, really used this, especially after the plane crash, to double down on their position as what Polish populist governments meant. And so they used this as a framing issue. So in the paper, we really go sort of deeply into these two cases and how they diverged based on their interests, despite the fact that they both had very similar, larger messages of populist governments, both anti-EU and increased sort of sovereignty messages, which some of our other panelists have talked about today. So, basically this, as Hadas has said, this is just one paper of a larger project in which we, you know, we do have lots of other comparisons between non-populist and populist states that have very similar core interests, and we trace sort of foreign policy differences between those two states. But, you know, what we really found in this paper was sort of a number of issues. We found that, first of all, we didn't see significant foreign policy differences based on the populist, non-populist cleavage alone. We see that on sort of other differences. And one implication of this, and this speaks to a lot of what we've discussed already today, and also Alex's work, is that while we may not see, I think, discrete foreign policy differences in short-term periods when we look at similar populist and non-populist states, you know, that doesn't discount the importance of rhetoric, the importance of these messages on the international system, and what this means over the long term. And so I think that's one thing that's very interesting in terms of what we have collectively brought together here. And I'm really interested to sort of bring this discussion into this session after we hear from our other panelists. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So second presentation is from Allison and Richard, Global Governance Under Populism, the Challenge of Information Suppression.
Okay, so I'll be presenting a new paper entitled Global Governance Under Populism, which is co-authored work with Allison and Ricky. The basic motivation for this paper is the basic idea that international organizations, IOs, need accurate and comprehensive information to perform their tasks well, to adequately fulfill their mandates. The challenge is that they're often deprived of this information. They often struggle to acquire this information when they rely on states, member governments to provide it. In the news recently have been various instances of this tension between IOs and member states when it comes to information sharing. It's been at issue with the WHO in China during COVID. It was at issue under the Trump administration with regards to climate IOs in particular. And lately it's been at issue between the IMF and Venezuela with regards to economic data. The literature points to a number of reasons for why states might vary in their propensity to provide IOs with requested data. One notable line of work differentiates between democracies and non-democracies, finding that democracies tend on average to be more transparent than non-democracies. Other work looks at the nature of information, its sensitivity for national security, the importance of a given piece of information for upholding global norms, and yet more work looks at economic incentives, how, for example, an interest in attracting investment might incentivize leaders to be more transparent than they otherwise would be. We argue in this paper that a distinct logic holds for scientific information, which we define here as information on energy and the environment and public health. We argue that scientific information is uniquely vulnerable to suppression by populists, and also that populists have a unique incentive to suppress scientific information as opposed to non-scientific information. We adopt the standard thin definition of populism in this paper, which everyone on this panel is familiar with. And we argue first that populist general anti-elite disposition gives them the incentive, the initial incentive to suppress scientific information, because scientific information we think has a uniquely elite character. It's of uniquely elite provenance. It's produced by scientists, produced by academics, produced by experts, produced by other putatively elite actors. It's difficult for non-experts to independently interpret and verify. And if you look at how populist politicians have often spoken about scientific issues, it's often cloaked in this language of anti-elitism. So Jean-Marie Le Pen, for example, calling environmentalism the new religion of the bourgeoisie. I should mention here that in this paper, we're mostly agnostic about where the suppression actually takes place. It could be a matter of populists eroding domestic data collection capacity, or it could be a matter of populists collecting data, but then just not reporting it. We do some tests in the paper trying to differentiate between these two mechanisms, which I could talk more about in the Q&A. So beyond populists having a unique incentive to suppress scientific information, we argue that the nature of scientific information gives them the political space they need to suppress this information without attracting a lot of domestic blowback, costly domestic political retribution. When it comes to other classes of information, like information on the economy, there are actually constituencies that may emerge and mobilize in favor of transparency, punish governments for being too opaque. When it comes to scientific information, we argue that if anything, domestic constituencies may actually lobby for suppression, lobby for less transparency. In doing work for this paper, we conducted interviews with senior officials at IOs active in scientific spaces, and they offered some initial support for this intuition. So one senior official at a health IO noted that during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, economic incentives weighed heavily on leaders as they were deciding whether or not to accurately report HIV/AIDS information. If you wanted to build up your tourism sector, you had an incentive to underestimate the true level of HIV/AIDS in your country. If you wanted to attract foreign aid, development aid, you might have an incentive to exaggerate the true level of HIV/AIDS prevalence. Beyond industry lobbyists potentially lobbying for suppression, we think that voters or supporters of populists may either support or just not punish leaders for suppressing scientific information. One reason for this is, as I mentioned, that it's just difficult for voters to independently interpret and verify scientific information. It's hard as a normal person to tell whether your country is accurately reporting greenhouse gas emission statistics accurately or not. And more than this, scientific information is often couched in this language of uncertainty. So we present results using confidence intervals. When we talk about some of the most pressing scientific issues of the day, like the future of COVID-19, the future of climate change, we often do so acknowledging a great deal of uncertainty about how bad things will get and the proper way of addressing these issues. We think this gives populist leaders the space they need to cast doubt on scientists' recommendations, scientists' findings, without attracting a lot of domestic blowback. So our empirical approach, we test suppression using a common method in the international political economy literature, which is to look at the extent to which countries actually report various data points to the World Bank, specifically the World Bank's World Development Indicators data set. We look specifically at missingness in 252 environment, energy, or health variables between the years of 1990 and 2018, with the idea being that greater missingness in these data points would suggest that a government is less transparent, is providing an IO with less data. We complement this with interviews of senior officials, as I mentioned, and then we also conduct some tests where we disaggregate these WDI variables by source, differentiating variables that rely exclusively on government-provided data from those that are subject to estimation by third-party actors. As a secondary test, we also look at the quality of data that populist governments report, considering that some populists may not entirely withhold data, they just may report less accurate data. And we do that specifically in the context of greenhouse gas emissions. So our primary predictor is a binary populism indicator from the Blair Institute. We cross-check this measure against other prominent populism data sets, including the BYU data. We opt for this measure because it has good temporal and geographic coverage. We include a standard set of covariates in our models, as well as standard statistical specifications. So our baseline results offer strong support for the basic intuition in the paper, which is that populists are associated with substantial increases in the rate of missingness in scientific variables, an increase of about 5 or 6% of a standard deviation, which in these models is equivalent to a decline in a country's polity score, a movement of a country towards more authoritarian levels of several points. Conversely, when you look at non-scientific variables in the World Bank's WDI dataset, variables on various economic indicators, you find no relationship between populists and non-reporting, no relationship between populists and missingness. We think this offers some support for the idea that there's something special going on with scientific information and populist governments. Next, we do the test where we disaggregate these variables by source. About half of the scientific variables in the World Bank's WDI dataset could be calculated by external actors if a government doesn't report. We expect to find the strongest results for raw state-provided data. And that's indeed what we find. We find that populists are associated with much higher rates of missingness in raw state-provided data, not data that's subject to estimation, imputation by these outside parties. We think this offers more support for the idea that there's some intentionality underlying the greater non-reporting, the greater missingness of variables under populist governments. Finally, we look at this test of data quality. The motivation for this test is the possibility that in some cases, the cost of just withholding data completely may be too great. They may just attract so much international sanction that even a populist who is certainly not a fan of IOs may think twice about just withholding data completely. In these cases, populists may just report lower quality data, less accurate data. We test this in the context of greenhouse gas emissions, where there's a large international regime complex and strong reporting requirements for various governments. We compare in this test raw state reported greenhouse gas emissions figures that are given to the UNFCCC, the UN body that encompasses the Paris Agreement, and compare these to third-party estimates of countries' greenhouse gas emissions calculated by this group called EDGAR, which is hosted by the European Commission. And we want to see whether the gap between these state reported and estimated figures increases when populists are in office. What we find is that populists are associated with a significant increase in the gap between these state reported and estimated emissions figures, an increase of about 36% in this model, which we think offers support for the idea that when the costs of just non-reporting entirely are too high, populists may just report lower quality data. And it's worth pointing out here that we find no clear directional effect here, suggesting that this may be a result of institutional erosion as opposed to populists intentionally trying to underestimate the true level of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so to wrap up, we find that populists withhold significantly more scientific data than non-populists, but we don't find a significant difference for non-scientific data. This suggests that populism may be a significant impediment to IO's functioning specifically in scientific domains, but there are steps that IOs can take to counteract or circumvent populist movements among member governments, specifically by lessening reliance on state-provided data, adopting methods of estimation, imputation to overcome intransigent governments. And I will leave it there. Thanks.
Super, Noah, thank you very much. Okay, let's get the list going for questions and comments on this third round of papers. And Cameron.
Great, thanks so much. Both these papers are super interesting. Noah, I was just thinking about your group's paper. I wondered if you had looked at any kind of interaction between populism and polity. In particular, are populists more successful in reducing information when they're like down in the anocracy range? We're doing some work on central bank independence, and for example, Erdogan just fired his third central bank governor in 2 years, right? But Turkey's down in like the -4 on the polity scale. So I'm just wondering if there might be something analogous with environmental information, if it's really those populists who've already, as you said, eroded the institutions such that they've moved down the scale.
Great, thanks. Richard?
Yeah, just a quick question for Hadas and Emily. Really enjoyed the paper. I think it ties well into ours. But just one question is, I noticed that you bring up Greece in the theory section as like motivation before the hypothesis comes up. And it was an interesting case to me because it sort of brought up this question of whether what you're capturing is really interdependence between like the EU countries and Greece in that case, or is it something about bargaining power more generally? So I'm thinking like countries in economic crises have no choice but to go to institutions, whether it be like the European Commission lending or the IMF in many of these cases. And so in that situation, can a populist really decide not to go to the IMF? Do they default on their loans, like which would be very consequential negative economic outcomes, et cetera? So basically, can you just talk more about like interdependence specifically versus bargaining leverage more generally and how that factors?
Great, thanks. Angelos next.
Yeah, I have questions for both papers. So to Emily and Hadas, it's more questions. Just I kind of missed. You said that you developed this concept of not exactly populist foreign policy, but I don't remember exactly how you said. So I was wondering if you can develop a bit this more, particularly with respect to how do you think this differs from what would be a non-populist foreign policy, as it were. So that's one question I have. And to know about, I found your paper very, very interesting. I wonder if I understood correctly, you said that one reason why populist governments could withdraw information would be, as you said, pressure from economic interests. Was that you mentioned something there, right? So is this correct? Would that be pressure from specific economic interests or from industries or something like that about withdrawing scientific information?
That is one of the points we made, yes.
I find it very interesting because conceptually there is a certain line of thought about populism being primarily a political phenomenon, right? So I'm thinking here about kind of more of Chickian liberal understandings, which is that governments engage with international organizations on the basis of domestic economic interests. But you seem to be saying that populists are also open to kind of pressures. However, they read those pressures as something that requires them not to engage with international organizations, but to essentially kind of undermine the work of international organizations, right? So I find that can this be kind of a reasonable comparison between the two approaches, how it relates to kind of standard societal liberal arguments about how governments engage with international organizations?
Okay, great. Just hold off 1 second. We'll get Allison in here too.
I really like your paper, Emily and Hadas, and I wondered, I actually, for what it's worth, I had the same reaction as Ricky, just whether a country's power is an omitted variable here or where it belongs in the 2x2. But I was also hoping you could say a little bit more upfront about how exactly, because in the paper you don't really discuss how you're going to measure whether international policies are similar and whether core strategic interests are the same. When I was reading it, it kind of felt like you'll know it when you see it, and you give examples and it does seem the same, but I just wanted to see, a definition or an actual measurement strategy. And then I totally understand why it's infeasible to do a whole bunch of cases, but it seems strange to do only 2 boxes in the 2x2. Like maybe you could add just a case from each of the other 2 boxes that you don't currently include.
Okay, super. So let's pick up and address those points, and let's start with Emily and Hadas.
I can start, you can jump in. So for interdependence or bargaining power, yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I think that because we were talking about the European Union, we stuck to interdependence because it's so high on some of the issues there. But actually, a more general theory and it even applies within the European Union. So within the European Union, you kind of can call it asymmetric interdependence in a way, which already includes the bargaining power that states have within the European Union. But I agree that ultimately, if you look at a more, and we should consider that, if you look at a more theoretical, like a broader theoretical point, then it is bargaining power. Because as we show, there are some countries in the European Union do have more of an ability to control not only European Union policy, but also their own path within the European Union. And some countries have less. So that's the example that we gave for what happens when Germany or France break European Union rules and what happens when smaller countries do that. It's not the only example. If you look at investigations against countries that violate the rules, actually the bigger countries tend to have more violations than the smaller countries. So, and bigger both economically and in terms of population. So that's a good point, and I actually agree. For what we called DTFPs, domestically targeted foreign policies, it's a good question. I went over it very briefly. So I should note that these are things that the difference between, I think that in general, you can find that states will carve their own path in this region where policies are less important. So so that is not the difference between populists and non-populists. The region of independence, I think, is the same for populists and non-populists. There, the question is, what are they going to do with this independence? And that's where actually the definition of populism gets into the point, but it's not so much, I think, about the ideological aspect. Sometimes it is, but a lot of it is about, to me, about the particular coalition building of populists that are sometimes non-traditional coalitions. Sometimes that's why they sometimes require specific non-programmatic things that they do in many cases. So I think a part of it is ideological, but a part of it is about the particular non-traditional, non-left-right coalitions that populists sometimes have. How do we measure things? So, you know what? Emily just wrote a comment to me on the paper that we didn't include in this one, a really large section of data and methods that we had in the previous version, and that's not good. So, so we should. We did look at actually more dry descriptive statistics measures to look at geopolitical interests, including just general economic measures like GDP and other such issues that we should include here. We also looked at the nature of import and export. I think we looked at the particular past that they had. They did differ on some issues like the year that they joined the European Union and of course the war in Yugoslavia. And we did write in what sense we think it matters. And to be honest, we should include all of that. So thank you. For measuring how they differ though, which is a different question. This is for measuring why they're the same, but for measuring how we would estimate difference, you know what? I think that we were hoping to achieve that with kind of close, because our previous case was included so much, again, more dry statistics about who the trading partners are and how do they change. But we still, even in that case, didn't define ex ante, how are we going to measure it? So that's a good point. I'm not sure how to do that, but I would love suggestions. So sorry, that was a lengthy bunch of responses, Emily, if you have stuff.
And I'll just jump in quickly to say that, you know, this, Hadas and I have written so many versions of this paper that were very broad and wide ranging. We have a version of this paper that includes Latin America with paired case studies that we will eventually put in a book. And so in that case, we show, for example, how in some populist states, they can default on their debt, right, to very disastrous consequences. So, you know, we've left that out, but we should include a note in this version about the different, you know, universe of cases and variation across populist regimes that we do touch on. And in regard to the domestically targeted foreign policies, you know, I think probably the kind of most amusing example is probably these billboards, right, which are ostensibly targeted at Hungarian-speaking immigrants, you know, and this was a really broad campaign that these billboards were placed like every 100 yards on the way to and from the airport in Budapest, and they basically said a different kind of message each time in Hungarian, warning immigrants not to take jobs. And this was like a central message of Orban's campaign, right? And this is just one example of that. There's other examples. And I think actually, you know, Allison, Noah, and Ricky's paper sort of fits in with that in the sense that, you know, there are reasons why maybe targeting science is a particular message when it comes to populists in terms of who they're speaking to domestically and the anti-elitism, right? So we're just trying to identify, you know, a certain aspect of foreign policy that has a real sort of domestic political component internal. And I think we'll try to clarify that more as we go along with the next version of this paper.
Great. Noah, over to you.
Okay, thank you for those questions and comments. First, in response to Cameron's question on the interaction of polity and populism, we do this test, and interestingly, you find that populism is associated with greater suppression across the polity spectrum, even among anocracies, sort of semi-democracies, and then full-fledged democracies, countries that score 9 or 10 on the polity scale. We also did an interaction with GDP per capita. And interestingly, what we find there is that the strongest results are for middle and high income countries. So this is not a matter of populists principally taking control in low income countries with low institutional capacity. This is them assuming office in more industrialized democratic states. In response to Angelos, so if I understand the question correctly, we're arguing that both special interest and domestic electoral pressures may drive reductions in the quality of cooperation between populist governments and IOs. It is likely that the mechanisms for these two dynamics would be a bit different. So when it comes to special interests, they might be particularly likely to take the initiative in pushing populists to erode data collection capacity to withhold data from IOs. When it comes to voters, they may not sort of pressure a government to cut funding for a very specific institution, but populists may be able to sort of take the suppression that they've done to voters and use it to basically demonstrate their anti-elite bona fides. So that would be my response to that question if I interpreted correctly. I'm not sure if Allison or Ricky have more to add on that.
I'll just say thank you for the comments. It was super helpful. I think Noah answered them well.
Just one thing that came to my mind as I was listening to both papers was how each of these presentations kind of help resolve a puzzle in the current news I've been thinking about, which is Orban's vaccine geopolitics and strategy, right? On the one hand, he actually completely abided by the EU agreement in terms of remaining in the pool. He didn't withdraw from it, but of course that agreement was only for EU approved vaccines. On the other hand, he sort of plays the kind of social response card by turning to both the Russians and the Chinese and dismisses the scientific authority of EU regulators for not having approved them. And so he adds those on top of the vaccine pool, but he's still maintaining his EU commitments, while of course the symbolic politics of being jabbed by sort of Sinovac. So I think it's a really nice way of combining all of your insights. And I think it's a really interesting reminder too, that the room here isn't necessarily, on these decisions, is to increase the space if possible. That's the ideal. It's not necessarily to make these zero-sum trade-offs on what's possible and what's not.
We do have one question in the chat that I can honestly turn to everyone because it's a very general one. Thank you for the interesting papers. Building on what Hadas said. Oh, thank you. Do you think populism can be a foreign policy tool for small states to enlarge their visibility or even influence internationally without changing their foreign policy in a strategic way? I can take a first step. I think that maybe, to be honest, it is maybe, but I think for the most part, a lot of small states, I'm not sure they want to be visible in the populist sense. And that's something that relates to what Aron said a few hours ago, some of her findings, that where do they give these speeches that are the populist speeches? They don't give them internationally. They give them in a campaign, and to some extent they give them on special occasions, but they don't, usually it's not the international arena where these things are happening. And I think what we're trying to say is that for a lot of the populist foreign policy, the arena, the important arena is not the international arena. But if someone else has something to add to this.
I'll say something. I know that Julia Gray has a new paper that deals with speeches at the UN. And I think there's a little bit of this sort of Trump sort of prominently gave the one speech at the UN where he attacks the international community, liberal order, et cetera. So that might be one venue to look at for internationally facing speeches where leaders often do show up, or at least other government representatives and diplomats, and might sort of try to signal their populist bona fides to an international audience. But Julia's work might be a good jumping off point.
If I can jump on that, I'm thinking two things here. I think one, particularly the question that when I discussed about something that the special issue that I'm part of, we're looking at now. I think the question of the diversification of international partnerships is particularly relevant here, because I think populists are quite good, are quite adept at presenting what even non-populists would normally do. Many non-populist normal governments would just be looking to promote relations where they can, if it's good for their interest, to find leverage, etc. I think populists are pretty good at kind of projecting this as kind of a certain theatricality of independence. And I'm thinking of cases of Greek foreign policy over the last 30, 40 years, where while nothing really changed in terms of practical policy, Greece continued being a member of NATO or the EU, populist leaders were good at projecting this as kind of more independent foreign policy. And Orban is particularly good at that. So I don't know if that's what the question was. I don't know if that's what the question was hinting at. So I think there is a certain way that populism can present new relationships as appearing significant or kind of novel or kind of radical departures, perhaps more than what they would normally appear if non-populist governments were attempting them.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to raise two questions to everyone, which are kind of questions that we were left with when writing our paper, and I think they're interested sort of to everyone's papers. So the first one is that we all find all kinds of, one commonality here is that every one of those papers addressed this topic in much more nuance than previous literature, which is very exciting and I think really wonderful to read. But one question that I was left with is about social pressure and international change. So ultimately, this is something that none of us studies, but as I said in the beginning of our presentation, it's a lot of social pressures that elect these populists to government, or the populist change that we see comes because of social pressure, whether it's, like Maria discussed, Euroscepticism, or whether it's a demand for protectionism, or just a demand for social change that we see all over. And so I wonder to what extent, if we do see that populism doesn't change that much in this area, then how do things change? Or do they change a lot in this area, or can changes come from non-populist directions? I wonder how are these social changes ultimately channeled into policymaking? I wonder, because we do wonder that too. And my other question is something that is always posed to us, and we already have an answer for it, but I don't know if it's a good one, which is the question of Brexit. Right, one of the biggest changes in international policy in recent years is a populist change, and it's not one that any of us really analyzes because it doesn't come from a populist government, but it is a populist change. And so again, I wonder how our different theories can weigh in on this question and discuss.
So, I mean, I have a question. So, I mean, technically the May government is classified as a populist term. And this is something that has always been kind of confusing to me. In the grand scheme of things, if you accept that classification that the May government was like somewhat a populist government, then Brexit is actually, implemented by somewhat a populist term. I don't think it answered your question, but.
Yeah, no, I meant like the decision on the Cameron, but even the May one, I don't know. She's not a populist. I understand that there are populists there. That's where it gets murky, I suppose. So one answer, yeah, I mean, for us, we just throw it away. We say, actually, the interesting part is the populist leaders are not entirely responsible for the most part, except for quite unique cases. And I think that kind of also relates to what JC and Cameron are saying. The reason that Trump is a little bit more reckless than others is both because what we're saying, interdependence is lower, or if you want, bargaining power is higher, but also because not only is it a presidential system, but it's one where it's very difficult to make domestic changes. And so maybe everything is channeled into the international decision making. But Brexit doesn't have a populist leader exactly that initiated it. So maybe at least that's our answer. But I still wonder, to what extent is it because of the rise of populism? I mean, must be.
And I think just to follow on from that, we discuss and everybody's discussed that, in this, many of the expectations that are sort of out there in popular literature derive from these significant cases, Brexit, Trump, right? The rhetoric that follows from these very proud, brash leaders. But one thing that all of the papers here have really done a great job at presenting is that, despite how, the evolution of rhetoric, both in terms of populism and nationalism, I think that Aron's findings were very interesting, actually, in terms of just tracking those trends over the years and how that has I think is probably kind of counterintuitive for most of us. Despite these sort of rhetorical trends that, all of our papers are really pointing out a lot of nuance in terms of how populism does affect foreign policy. And I think, Angelos, your paper on Greece is actually quite interesting because, I really liked how you showed the populist coalition, both in left and right, and how, populism itself is not necessarily driving things. You have to really look at different ideological persuasions to understand what will happen in terms of foreign policy. And even the sort of broad cross-country cases that were presented here today, JC and Cameron and Allison and Ricky and Noah, you're showing us that across this wide scale political spectrum, we see a lot of difference, whether it be in terms of presidential system or parliamentary system, or, what is just the sort of different situation of each state. And I think that that's an important takeaway to note. And going back to Maria's paper, which I also found so interesting, was, looking at just sort of the demand side of this, and this of course brings us back to our favorite word in political science, endogeneity, right? What caused what? But I think that all of the papers have done a really good job at examining the very multifaceted nature of populism and foreign policy. And I, for one, am really pleased by this very collaborative atmosphere. And I think it's fantastic. And we're really grateful for all of you taking the time to participate today. So we have one thing in the chat, but before I look at that, we just want to say that we are hoping to reconvene at some point down the line, possibly in the fall or so, to do another follow-up to see where we are with our work and in different projects. And we hope to sort of keep this community going. So, be on the lookout for further communication from us. And, please feel free to share across this email distro that we have, especially now as we're not back to, IRL meetings yet. We hope that we can sort of keep this community up until maybe one day. I don't know, maybe will there be a real in-person ISA next year? Maybe.
As a side note, we were planning on having this in person. We submitted an application for a grant to hold this in person. We were all supposed to be in New York in fancy hotels, and not us. And sorry. This was supposed to come with food.
Yeah, so we're hoping to reconvene either in fall or spring next year, to be hosted by, we'll figure that out later. But so we'll keep in touch, and hopefully we can keep this group going and we can all see each other next year at ISA. And please, let us know if you have any questions or you want to further share your work. And we're looking forward to seeing all of these things in print soon. We know that they're at various stages of, some have been published, some are under review now. So we're very eager to see how they are moving forward. Anything else before we wrap up? I'm a big proponent about giving people a few minutes of their day back on Zoom. So if nobody objects to that, we want to thank you all.
We can let everyone go.
Yeah, thank you all again so much, and we'll be in touch.
And thank you to the Jordan Center and to NYU CEMS for organizing.